Hello and welcome to the May 2018 Bloke on the Range Q&A. Just me and a gat. I asked for 10 questions, I got a few more, but I'll try and get through all of them. So, kicking it off. Tangero. What's your favourite type of shooting competition for handgun and rifle? You've demonstrated a great variety of competitions on the channel, and I'm curious if you have a particular preference. I like it all, most of it, really. I used to like doing IPSC a lot, that kind of thing, steel plate, when I had the opportunity. Really like that. In terms of more static disciplines, actually my favourite pistol competition is the old ISSF standard handgun course of fire, precision and duel. In fact, the dueling part of it particularly, where the target's turn, you've got 3 seconds to come up, take a shot, and, well, then you've got 7 seconds before you've got to take another one. And I do that one quite a lot. Rifle, I like rapid fire competitions, snap shooting, that kind of thing. Don't get a lot of opportunities to do that these days. But yeah, sort of to turn it around slightly differently, what I do a lot of these days is the Swiss 300 meter program, and I try and do as much dueling, or Schnellfeuer it's called, not the Olympic rapid fire where you got one shot on each of 5 targets quite quickly, but it tends to be 5 shots on a dueling target in 30 seconds or a minute. I end up doing a lot of that. So next one, Camarade asks, coming from a Canadian, what is your personal favourite Lee-Enfield production factory? Long Branch, Maltby, Savage, perhaps Lithgow? Also, can you say tabarnak using your best impression at a French Canadian / Quebec accent? Well, did the second part of that. It's awful. Sorry. Right. I don't really have a favourite. It's a slightly strange question. Yeah, I have no particular attachment or reason to be attached to any of them. None of them were anywhere near where I've ever lived or anything like that. So in terms of what produces the best quality, there's sort of, a lot of people seem to think that the Long Branch rifles have better steel in them. Doesn't seem to really be the case. I mean, you find a rifle in equivalent condition from any of the factories, they're all as good as each other. They're all made to the same set of basic standards, and there's not any particular factory that was renowned for bad quality metalwork. The Indian rifles made at Ishapur, sometimes they've got inferior quality timber as a function of sourcing the timber. But in terms of the North American or British factories and the factories producing the number 4, it's much of a muchness. By the force of things, I've had 1 BSA Shirley and 3 Long Branch, 2 of which were the 1950 Greek contract and had feed geometry issues, which is strange. Never quite worked out why that would be so, but they all had feed issues. I had to fettle the mags. There was something with the way the rounds came out of the charger that was not quite right. So, next up, Kyle. The Canadians are out in force. Smiley. You mentioned previously that you used to shoot IPSC but have since stopped. Did it just lose its appeal? What did you shoot with? Have you had a chance to try a 2 or 3 gun match? It has not lost its appeal. It's just a question of time and availability. There's an IPSC handgun club fairly near here, but it's just time. With work, kids, the channel, all the other things I have to do, I just don't have time. And when I get back into it, I want to be in a situation where I can devote time to it. As a shooting discipline, it is pretty time consuming. You're going to be spending typically half a day or a whole day on a range and get about 4 minutes of shooting in total. And I just can't give up the time. Plus, I had a habit of range officering and things like that. So it just became too time consuming, and it was something that I ended up leaving behind in Holland. Now, what I shot it with, I started it with a badly chosen gun. I had a Pardini GT9 6-inch that I shot in open with a slide mounted dot. That was a complete waste of time, effort and money. I then swapped that for a 6-hour P226 that I shot in production, which was all right. And then I changed to revolver and I shot a 625, one of the ones with crappy soft steel, as a 625-8 from about 2006, I think. Not good, not good. I mean, I like shooting revolvers. I shoot a revolver fast better than I shoot an auto fast. So I have a massive preference for shooting auto. The principle of the pistol was great, but it's just that era where Smith & Wesson's execution was poor. Really poor. For rifle, I shot it mostly with my Oberland Arms AR-15 in semi-auto standard. I also shot Franken rifle twice against semi-autos. Once before conversion with a dot, once after conversion again with the dot. In fact, it's the same dot that I had on the Pardini before, and there's something deeply satisfying about beating a third of the semi-auto open shooters with a bolt gun. That was very satisfying, very, very satisfying. Have I had a chance to try a 2 or 3 gun match? No, not had the opportunity. Really, really want to. It's in the planning. I'd hoped to set something up this year, but then my sister-in-law decided to get married at about the time that would have been taking place. So that's put the kibosh on that, but there's a replacement project instead. Little nasty teaser there. Neil asks, long shot, but any chance of y'all coming to the US and doing Desert Brutality 2019, assuming Carl decides to run it? Bloke on the range versus in range would be great. I would love to. We'll have to see what it looks like time-wise. Would love to. We shall see if we can fit that in. Tyler asks, the impression I get of the Swiss gun culture is that the things that are likely to be seen by the general public are kept very traditional, while things that might raise people's eyebrows are done at private ranges. By that I'm not talking about safety, but rather more traditional target shooting as opposed to speed shooting and shooting while moving. Am I very far off the mark? I think that, yes, the less traditional stuff is done out of the public view, but not because they want it done out of the public view necessarily. It's just by the force of things that the ranges where you can do that kind of thing, they tend to be private, they tend to be underground. The village ranges where all the traditional stuff goes on are right there in the villages and quite visible. Certainly things like machine gun shoots, there's a sort of... that, on the other hand, there is a sort of unspoken rule that thou shalt not film and publish it on the internet, because it's sort of an open secret that it takes place. I mean, it's right there in the law. You can read that it's possible, and it gets organised. That's kept out of view because if the press got hold of that, that would be problematic. Excuse me, a bit dry-throated today. But yeah, I think it's just what you can do on the public ranges is the standard Swiss out-of-service shooting program, and the rest is done on private ranges, which are typically underground. So that's where that comes from, really. Next up, Kevin asks, what were the first guns you ever bought, and what got you into shooting in the first place? When I was a kid, I was taking air rifle shooting a couple of times and really loved it and was kind of good at it. Got the opportunity a few times. My parents would never let me buy an air rifle, which was interesting. But the school I went to, the senior school I went to, had a 25-metre rifle range. We thought it was a 25-yard rifle range, and we were always kind of surprised when we went and shot competitions elsewhere, and the target seemed a bit bigger, and we always scored better. But yes, our range was about 10% longer than it should have been, and it was reflected in the scores. So at school, I spent an awful lot of time shooting 22 rimfire several times a week, and in summer we would go to Bisley and shoot target rifle at 300 to 1,000 yards. Doing that frequently from the age of 13, and I always had a bit of an interest in military history and in guns in general. I tried to expand my horizons as much as possible. The first rifle I bought, I think, was what you'd call an L39 alike. It was a Lee-Enfield No. 4 converted to 7.62 target rifle with actually one of the Enfield heavy barrels on it. It was an interesting one. It was sort of kind of the most basic conversion. It was a rebarreling. I don't even think they changed the extractor on it. Still had the 303 magazine because under the competition rules you were single loading anyway. And it was weird. It would shoot these weird split groups. This particular one, I think there was a problem with the crown. That it would shoot these incredibly tight groups and then throw flyers. It wasn't like it would shoot a 2-minute group or something. It would shoot sort of a 1-minute group with like 1 round in 10 as a flyer. I ended up swapping that with a club for the BSA Shirley number 4 in 303, which I gave to someone to sort the bedding out, and it turned out that he bedded it like a target rifle, and it was horrible. I had to give it to someone else to fix properly, so that cost more money than it should have done. I then had an Irma M1 carbine in 22 rimfire, which I replaced with a Ruger 1022 for lightweight sport rifle, so basically shooting pistol courses of fire with lightweight rifles in the UK after the ban, and yeah, a couple of Mosins, and I think that was it before I left the UK. Then I went to Holland, bought that Pardini, and it sort of went from there. Tim asks, what is something you'd like to do a series of videos on but are unable due to budget, time, effort? Everything. I would like to do videos on everything. In the immediate, I don't know, there's just so much. I like to do Swiss machine guns and things like that, but it's just, yeah, budget, time and effort. That's the problem there. The next one, Gabriel asks, this isn't really necessarily shooting related, but I'll give it a quick treatment. Looking from the outside, Switzerland looks to be very politically homogeneous and stable. Is that true? I understand that in the Swiss system, the central government has very little power compared to the cantons, but do you still go through annoying bouts of far left, far right politics? No. Fundamentally, the Swiss system is based on the American system as it was at the time in the 1820s-ish. The difference is that the Bundesrat is a compromise set up with representatives of every party. It's a lot more consensus based. There's a lot of variation canton to canton. There's a language barrier in the politics, but it's quite stable. And one of the things that sort of touches on what I do professionally, one thing that's interesting as a place to have a company, it's not just the tax treatment, because it's not really the tax haven of myth and legend. It might have been once, but it isn't. What it is an extremely sensible, yeah, kind of, sorry, slip of the tongue there, is an extremely stable regulatory environment. You're not going to get a sudden change in government that's then just going to suddenly double corporation tax or ban stuff. It's a lot more, things change a lot more slowly in general. So it's a stable environment like that. Next, Dominic Scherkel. That sounds like a very Austrian name. Do you plan to do a video on the M95 with Kert Kerl? I'm still planning on doing videos on the M95. It's a question of time. I've got to. It's on my list. I've got lots and lots of stuff on my list. I've got to get in my reloading room. I need my case trimmer, but I've got it set up to do something. I've got a bunch of 303 brass I need to trim, so my case trimmer is set up for that. Haven't had time to do that yet. Once I've done that, then I can reset the case trimmer for 8x50R and do that video. Kurt's a German with a slightly suspect, slightly French accent. I don't know where that comes from, really. I'm not entirely sure it'd be appropriate for a German to do a video on an Austrian rifle. I think that might just awaken too many demons. But yes, the M95, probably not Kert. Giulio asks, I understand that Switzerland's small arms establishment toyed for some time with small caliber rounds, 6 to 7 millimeters, in the late 1800s. Given their keenness on ballistic performance and precision shooting, why did they settle instead on a full power round? I think it was the commercial establishment. It was SIG. It was the Mondragon and Rubin. Rubin was a colonel. Rubin was involved with the Swiss ammunition plants and so on. The problem is that these small, fast rounds of the era were way beyond the metallurgy of the day and the powder technology of the day. You look at the hassle that was had with the 6mm Lee, bit of a barrel burner, massive barrel fouling, 276 Enfield around the same period, that basically, once the ballistics get interesting from a modern perspective, you get horrific barrel life, horrific barrel fouling, metallic fouling, throat erosion with the powders of the day. What's now considered as full power large bore, so sort of 30-ish caliber, it's a compromise that most people settled on. Okay, you've got some countries that went a bit smaller. I mean, when you think of the Italian 6.5, it was a heavy round-nose bullet at an unimpressive velocity because that's what the metallurgy and the powder tech could cope with. The Swedish 6.5 was long and round-nose until around the time of the Second World War, and then they had two types of ammunition when they made a Spitzer. I think it's just the case of the tech of the day wasn't up to it, so it didn't really happen. And fundamentally, even with target shooting with the rifle tech of the era, you can't really wring that extra performance out of it, particularly in a military context. I mean, the Swiss from the military context considered the K11, which is the least accurate of the rifles, militarily adequate, but the target shooting influence was such that they kept a long rifle where they really didn't need one, and the K31 is more accurate than it needs to be. Interestingly, on the stats I've got, the K11 matches up exactly with the German Gewehr 98 in accuracy terms. Just a random factoid there. Next question by Ben was already answered by a launch, so we'll skip that one. Dave posted something, but it's more a statement than a question, so I shall leave that aside. So next up is Joshua, with the UK, Canada, Australia, etc. all used the same rifle until it became time to replace the L1A1 SLR. What caused them to all replace the L1A1 with completely different weapons from each other? I think this goes into the sort of philosophy was what was going on in the various eras, because the adoption of the L1A1 was the 1950s. The replacements was all 1980s, 1990s. First thing that's going on there is in the 50s is NATO standardization, because there was a real push to try and get the FAL in various forms as the NATO AK, basically. It was the NATO rifle, and it almost was. The US went a different way for its own reasons and then promptly went in a different direction. The French were busy all going their own way, like Fleetwood Mac, and then pulled out of NATO anyway. So even though Australia is not in NATO, it's part of the Commonwealth. The Commonwealth was much, much stronger in terms of mutual defence back then than it is now. So it was logical that once Britain had decided on the FAL, which actually Germany decided on as the G1, and the Belgians, having recently been invaded twice by the Germans, weren't too keen on having the Germans manufacture it. They wanted them to buy it. So the Germans then went on to the G3 because of the Belgians. And yeah, lots and lots of rifles adopted. Lots and lots of rifles adopted. Lots and lots of countries adopted the FAL. Once the UK had adopted it, it made sense for the rest of the Commonwealth to adopt it as well. So Canada, Australia, New Zealand, they're not all quite the same versions, but they're all the same basic rifle. By the time we get to the 80s and 90s, replacing it, there's less emphasis on everyone in NATO and the Commonwealth having the same rifle. There's less presumption that if the Brits get involved in something, the Australians and the New Zealanders will get involved in something. The Australians and the New Zealanders sort of align themselves, and they both adopted the Steyr AUG for those reasons. Again, not quite the same, but it made a lot of sense, because if there's something going down that Australia is involved in, New Zealand might be, and vice versa. So there was a lot more paying your money and taking your choice at that stage. I mean, the other thing is, if you go and look back at the FAL of the era, it's probably, of the rifles that could have been chosen, it's probably the best all-rounder if you're going for European design. I'm a big fan of the AR-10 and have had a Portuguese contract one for a while, and it was great, but it wasn't quite as developed a design. The FAL is a long line. It's the sort of combination of several designs. It's a mature design. It was a slightly sort of conservative design to adopt. It makes sense. By the time we're into the 5.56 era, yeah, no one in their right mind, aside from the Brits, was going to adopt the SA-80 anyway. I mean, why would you? There's other better designs out there, bullpup, non-bullpup. Yeah, so people went in different directions. Hunter asks, what were the Swiss infantry tactics when dealing with tank threats in the interwar and World War II years? I know the Sturmgewehr 57 had a barrel-mounted grenade launcher, but was there a clamp-on launcher for the K31 or earlier rifles, or did the Swiss have a dedicated anti-tank rifle? Answer to all of that, yes. Interwar was inadequate and was going down the lines of everybody else, so there were some anti-tank rifles. The Solothurn factory was making various anti-tank rifles for others. S200, if I remember rightly. The Dutch had some. All sorts of people bought these various things. The Swiss didn't really buy enough of anything. I don't, off the top of my head, know exactly what designs they adopted in what quantities, and they've come up in auction occasionally, various single-shot anti-tank rifles, things like that. There was the 4.7 centimetre Infanteriekanone, which was an interwar development. Nowhere near enough of them at the outbreak of war. During the war, they built loads and loads more of them. And then during the war, they developed clamp-on grenade launchers for K11s and K31s because it's a cheap, easy way to give lots and lots of people anti-tank capability. That carried over into the Sturmgewehr 57. Give everybody anti-tank capability, give everyone a couple of anti-tank warheads, and crack on. The irony is, and this is something I'll get into with the World War II project, is that all of the steel to make all these weapons during the Second World War, particularly anti-tank weapons and artillery, that had to come from Germany. So to defend against Germany, they had to trade with Germany, and this is part of why they were treading this absolutely taut rope, and in this awful paradox where to defend against the only possible enemy who they knew was planning to invade at some point when they got round to it, they had to trade with them. They had to get steel from them. Yeah, interesting situation to be in, often lost in the noise of the 90s revisionism and the banks and what have you, but yeah, interesting story. Vivian asks, I've heard there was a kit to convert the M1 Garand into a detachable box magazine fed rifle. Any truth to that? Drop-in kit? No. They can be converted, but it's a one-way street. You can't back convert it. And yeah, gunsmith work. I mean, there's various prototypes that were converted, but you have to machine the receiver. You probably have to take BAR mags and mod them as well. But because the magazine system in the M1 is integral to the rifle, there's two tongues that come down inside with guide rails for the follower, and there's not enough width to put a magazine in, so there's no drop-in kit. You've got to machine all that out. If you look at the receiver on an M14, it's much flatter. There's less stuff on the underside, so there's room for the magazine to go in there. And the last one, Danbis. I've read about a piece of German propaganda on a gun magazine that the British would use the magazine cutoff on their Lee-Enfields to break the tip off the cartridge in order to achieve better wounding potential. I'm curious whether you can really do that. That's the German propaganda, was that the tip of a Mark 7 bullet does fit in the little hole. It's a little, I believe it's a little spotting hole for manufacturing. You can stick the tip of a Mark 7 bullet in there, and by wiggling a lot you can break it off. There is some film of this. Matthias used it in an episode. I can't find it back immediately, but it is there. They were claiming that the Brits would break the tips off the bullets. I think the reality of this I mean, any soldier caught with ammunition modified in that way was going to be for it. The reality of it is that 303 Mark 7 ammunition, it has an aluminium, later sometimes as a wartime economy, a fibre tip in it. What this does is it makes the bullet a bit longer than it should be, in inverted commas, for its weight. It's 174 grains, but it's quite long. Puts the centre of mass further to the rear, improves the accuracy, and also means that it's more likely to tumble. So compared to the German Esgeschoss, 153-ish grain, with also flat base, with a length appropriate for its weight, it doesn't have the same sort of wounding potential because it's not as unstable when it hits squishy stuff. I suspect that the Germans were surprised by the wounding potential of 303 Mark 7, and someone spotted that the tip would fit in this, you could break it off. It's not going to be good for your mag cutoff because it's just a piece of spring steel. You're going to have to put a lot of force in. If I were to try and do this with modern ammunition, it won't do the same thing because it's breaking off the tip, basically, the aluminium, and tearing that bit off. Modern ammunition doesn't have that. And interestingly, some of the US manufactured 303 ammunition for Lend-Lease in the Second World War also doesn't have it. So ballistics will be not quite the same, but a random tangential aside there. So yeah, I think that's the reality behind that. The thing is, the idea that the hole was intended for that is silly because the hole predates the Mark 7 ammunition. The hole's always there. Mark 6 ammunition's round nose. There's no pointy bit to get in there anyway. So there you go. So I hope my rambling along there was at least a little bit interesting. If you survived this far, thank you. Thanks for watching. Please like and subscribe. If you want to ask a question, please consider supporting Bloke on the Range on Patreon, because it's patrons who get the chance to ask questions. So thanks a lot, and see you next time. Bye.